Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Up for Growth 2021, the virtual summit for housing changemakers. My name is Mike Kinsella, CEO of Up for Growth, a national cross-sector member network committed to solving the housing shortage and affordability crisis through data-driven research and evidence-based policy. Membership is open to organizations of all sizes, and if you'd like to learn more, you can navigate to the link shown at the bottom of the slide. I'd encourage you to do so. Before I begin, I'd like to thank all of our stakeholders, our board members, our speakers, and in particular, the Up for Growth team. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Leah MacArthur, Erica Bateman, Gabby Cezanne, Lauren Chirac, and Melissa Winkler for all of their work in making this event happen. One of the ways that our organization works to drive change is through actively building and supporting networks of change makers to shape and advocate for nonpartisan policies at all levels of government. And this virtual conference is a key element of our work. Over the next several weeks, we're going to feature policymakers, advocates, and experts working at the local, state, and federal levels. This week happens to be focused on local policy innovation. And after today's keynote, please join us for two more panel discussions on why pro-housing is environmental policy happening this Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Pacific, as well as local policy practices and solutions to land use and zoning happening this Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Finally, a few housekeeping notes. Throughout today's presentation, all attendees will be camera off and muted. As you have questions, please submit via the chat function on your Microsoft Teams application. Questions will be answered at the conclusion of Mayor Fisch's remarks. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Mayor Alex Fisch of the city of Culver City, California. Mayor Fisch was elected to City Council in April 2018. Actually, a momentous month for pro-housing policy, as that was also the year that Up for Growth officially launched. Mayor Fisch previously served as the chair of the city's Committee on Homelessness and now sits on the Housing and Homelessness Subcommittee, as well as the Mobility, Traffic, and Parking Subcommittee. Through these roles, the mayor is able to make the housing and transit connection, a topic that, again, we're going to discuss in further detail at tomorrow's Housing and the Environments panel. Mayor Fisch also engages in regional government, representing the city of Culver City in the West Side City's Council of Governments. In this role, he represents WestCog as its representative to the Southern California Association of Governments, which has become more active on housing allocations under recent legislation under the Housing Accountability Act and RHNA. Outside of his role at the city of Culver City, Mayor Fisch is an attorney for the California Department of Justice. Previously, he was a shareholder at the Century City law firm and was a founding director for the Institute of Field Research. Mayor Fisch is a pro-housing champion doing great work on the ground in Culver City, and I, for one, look forward to his insights on what policy challenges and opportunities he sees, and where the conversation at the state and federal level can support further work. Without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to Mayor Fisch.
Thank you so much, Mike. That's quite an introduction. I'll try to meet the standard that you set. Good afternoon to most of the people here, and good morning to folks on the West Coast. My name is Alex Fisch. I'm the mayor of Culver City, California, home to about 70,000 jobs at employers like Sony, Amazon Studios, Apple, TikTok, MedMen, Scopely, and sort of HBO. We have very funky borders here. If you haven't heard of Culver City before just that, and you're just learning all that for the first time, you're probably thinking that we're one of those big U.S. cities that is out there that you never hear about, like at least an Oxnard, right? Maybe a Garland, Texas, or Newport News, Virginia. Well, no. The population of Culver City is 40,000 people, about the same as it was in 1980, living in about 17,000 households, which is only a little bit more than in 1980. And incidentally, I was elected to City Council in 2018 in an off-cycle April election with just 4,020 votes. That was a record turnout at the time and the most votes ever received by a candidate, but 4,020 votes has me in a position where hundreds of thousands of people are affected by the decisions we make, where I'm on the regional council for the Southern California Association of Governments, which is just 80 people making massive decisions for a region of about 19 million people. And this is about where an engineer with an interest in the political economy of cities might say, well, there's your problem. And we'll pick this back up shortly, but I just want to take a moment to express my incredible gratitude to Up for Growth for inviting me to speak today. If I can leave you with one thing, I hope it's just a little bit of my belief that the most economically and culturally vibrant places in the United States are in a severe, every single one of them, in a severe state of housing scarcity. That this condition is almost entirely a political choice, and that we can fix it, but we'll need courage and sustained effort at each of the federal, state, and local levels of government. So when I say that it's a problem that I was elected in an off-cycle election with just 4,020 votes for a city of 40,000 people with jobs of at least 70,000, why is that? You know, I'm going to ask you to bear with me because it is a problem, but it's also an opportunity. The baseline reality, and I think everyone on this call is the type of person who knows this, is that cities are really regional labor markets. You know, how far are you willing to travel, mostly drive in the United States for a job? It's probably an hour. You know, we certainly have our hour-and-a-half super commuters in the Bay Area and Los Angeles. People driving 3 hours a day out of their homes just to have a decent job. But it just reflects that our cities are many things, but one of the most important things is their labor markets. And Culver City is an enclave of a massive labor market that is also a job center. And it has been since its founding, when Harry Culver convinced Thomas Ince to locate his studio here. And as a side note, if you get into Culver City, if I convince you that this is an interesting place, look into Ince's death. It's been the source of persistent rumors, speculation, and legend that pull in Marion Davies, Charlie Chaplin, and William Randolph Hearst. This exciting time in Los Angeles history. Not as interesting as Hollywood intrigue and legend, is a dynamic that's emerged over the last couple decades that makes Culver City, I contend, an important case study for anyone looking at economic dynamism, the current trends of political economy really throughout the world, and housing, that most local of decision-making points, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the short version of that story is that we've added tens of thousands of jobs, many of them extremely high quality jobs, and practically no housing. And just to give you a sense, I often tell people we've done economic development in this city. We have not done the sort of subsidies, tax breaks, or really anything to lure companies here. That is a great reflection of sort of the trends that all of our cities face. The contrast I always point out to people is that Buffalo, New York, gave, I believe, an Elon Musk company, millions and millions of dollars with the promise of 5,000 jobs. They never materialized, and never in the quality that Buffalo policymakers would like. Whereas Culver City, just by virtue of its location, enviably in the center of many parts of Los Angeles, with access to the airport, many top quality higher education institutions, we simply just need to maintain a well-governed city, and jobs appear, which is astonishingly can create sort of a political problem here, which has got to be unique for many cities. And just as a quick anecdote, we recently got the good news that Apple wanted to expand its workforce here by more than 3,000 jobs, and they asked for a quote. And I think most elected officials would give a very boosterish quote. But I know my constituents, and they hear 3,000 jobs, and they hear traffic, and they hear displacement pressure. And again, these are political failings. Jobs are a good thing. This is a country where you need jobs to to pay for your housing, to get healthcare, for everything. It's essential, and we really need to create the space for people to take advantage of economic dynamism. We need to make sure that that truly, when the flood comes in, it's managed well and lifts all boats. And housing is the place where we can do that. What happens when you add tens of thousands of jobs and practically no housing? Well, let me start with a story again, and then I'll give you the numbers. But when after law school, I clerked for a federal judge who had been a Angelino for decades. And when I told him, he, like many federal judges, he had a sort of a mentor role for his clerks. And after moving on and going into private practice, I told him that I'd bought a house, shared the news with him. And he asked where, and I said Culver City. And he said, "Oh, Cheapwood." And I said, "What do you mean Cheapwood, Judge?" He said, "Well, it isn't Hollywood. It's not Beverlywood. It's certainly not Westwood. It's Cheapwood." And so since that time, 16 years ago, the cost of the median home in Culver City has more than doubled. Since 2000, when Culver City's economic recovery or really blossoming really kicked into high gear, the median home prices have gone from about $250,000 to probably 1.3 million today. And given the housing stock, a lot of those are simply dirt. That's simply land value. During that time, household incomes have gone up markedly, but not at the same pace because of the security that homeownership confers in the United States. And this is a good spot to start to unpack how we got here, how every city in the same position has gotten here. I'm looking at the peninsula in the Bay Area, where Apple and all these tech companies have really started and can no longer grow because of local constraints. And frankly, where every city that experiences economic success will end up if we don't change the direction and this dynamic. So, this is a good spot to talk about the problems, and it's impossible to address this without starting with NIMBYism. Not something I like to talk about, but you have to if you're talking about housing and what's wrong. I mentioned that household wealth has not gone up, or household income has not gone up at the same rate as housing prices. Obviously, housing prices going up at that rate mean that there's been a tremendous amount of household wealth generated. But people who bought their house for $250,000, with an income at the time of, say, $50,000 and not extraordinary career growth, feel very middle class because their income is very middle class, even as they sit on $1 million of household wealth. And in coastal cities, I think that creates a certain disconnect where housing is a speculative investment. It's a highly leveraged investment. The federal government subsidizes that investment. And in a place like California, it's an extremely lucrative investment where you can put a small amount down and cash out someday for a tremendous amount of money. At the same time, there's no denying that home is home and your neighborhood is home and you have emotional attachments to your neighborhood. And so we have this discomfort with capitalism, frankly, and change and investment alongside the reality that people need to live somewhere. And if you have a tremendous amount of demand for a place, that's going to cause prices to go up, land prices inevitably. And the question of whether home prices go up with that is, again, solely a political choice. This disconnect is, I think, why you see people talking about the financialization of housing. If you look at the UN Human Rights Council report on the financialization of housing and the right to adequate housing just in 2017 that I think sparked a lot of that discussion, that report is about favorable tax treatment for real estate investment in the United States, specifically calling out the mortgage interest deduction, and about rent-seeking behavior that's only possible because of scarcity. So when a hedge fund, and I used to work for them, when a hedge fund goes and invests in older housing stock, paints it, and charges a lot more, they're doing that because they can they can rent out housing that frankly is older and maybe has significant issues for much more because there's insufficient new production. So I'm sort of getting at the psychology of NIMBYism, in my opinion, but I've never bought that it's solely about greed or home prices. I certainly get those emails, but I think it's fundamentally about this discomfort. And so you have this bizarre situation where, I'm glad that Up for Growth is a nonpartisan organization, because the solution, I think that pro-housing policy is progressive policy, but I also think that there's plenty of conservative reasons for it as well. And I'll tell you that there's no solution that's not somewhat bipartisan, because the opposition is bipartisan. I get emails that will say, "Don't strip my property rights," because we're talking about loosening zoning restrictions, which is not stripping someone of property rights. It's restoring property rights. People are conceptualizing, conservative-minded people sometimes are conceptualizing their property rights as extending to other people's backyards. At the same time, I brought up the UN Human Rights Council and the financialization of housing, because you'll also hear people on the left citing that housing is a human right is in opposition to housing, and citing an anti-Wall Street streak as a reason not to house people, when nothing in the Human Rights Council's report discusses housing production, because building houses is not in any way specifically good for Wall Street. Not building houses simply creates an arbitrage opportunity and an opportunity to take advantage of scarcity that smart people in finance will take advantage of. Ultimately, these arguments, however, are advanced by a small minority of people, I believe. They feel these things intensely, and neighborhood change, the prospect of it inspires stronger reactions than anything else I've dealt with in my short time on council. And during that time, we've enacted rent control. We've imposed a real estate transfer tax that was that's one of the most progressive and broadest in California. And we've dealt with policing issues. And it is talking about legalizing fourplexes that has brought on some of the most emotional opposition that I've seen. So we've got a small group of people who are highly motivated. And you've even got people who support housing justice. You have a small group of people who are very motivated. You have diffuse benefits to people who don't live here yet when you talk about adding housing. And at the same time, in the background is consistently, poll after poll, people generally are, in the abstract, supportive of housing justice measures. The problem is that as you get specific with policy changes to address those measures, to implement those measures, when you start talking about blocks and neighborhoods, that intense opposition can address and has superior messaging discipline to get the people who have never really thought about this stuff before. And those diffuse benefits aren't quite as meaningful outside of the context of a survey. When you get down to the block level, when you get down to the neighborhood level, a vocal minority can take over the messaging. And that is a big part of what's happened. Because just as important as the phenomena of NIMBYism is the fragmentation of government in the United States and the supremacy of exclusive enclaves with respect to land use decisions. Local government is the place where land use is dictated. It's such a part of American law and practice that people think it's an affront to democracy when democracy results in land use decisions being made at another level, or land use decisions simply changing, going in a way that people did not expect 10 years ago. It's also, this phenomena, this fragmentation, has led to the phenomena of fiscalization of land use, where you have separate legal entities, little individual cities, competing for tax generators. So, trying to get the new car sales, trying to get the Costco in the case of Culver City, one of our favorite things. And, classic example of this is Culver City. Right? If you look at the borders, I mentioned those funky borders. The city clearly was growing to try and reach the ocean. At one point, there's a large part that's surrounded mostly by Los Angeles. It was once, that little panhandle was once the site of a dog track, because that was a money generator. Then it became the site of a Costco, because that's a money generator and a traffic generator. So this fragmentation in a place like California and many other states where property taxes are constrained, in our case by Prop 13, that limits property taxes to 2%, and they can, I'm sorry, 1%, 2%. I don't think about property taxes that much because of Prop 13, but they can only grow at 2% per year. And so many cities don't look at new residents as a source of revenue for the city, which leads to accepting jobs in retail and shunning new residents. You know, it's a self-reinforcing phenomena of there's no financial incentive for the city to add residents, or at least that's the perception. And there's, you know, if you've got to go pick up the kids and face someone who really, really hates the idea of duplexes on their blocks, there's not a lot of incentive to change the rules and welcome new neighbors. The other part of that fragmentation is that phenomena that I just mentioned. I am a part of my community, which is a great thing for democracy in many ways, but it also means that those 4,020 votes out of some 29,000 voters, if you have off-cycle elections, you know that there are single issue, if you're a local elected official, you know that there are single issue voters on the question of housing, and they oppose housing. They'll say that they don't oppose housing, but then those are not the people I've ever seen turn out in support of a project. I have seen some of those people. I've come to know some of those people in opposition to the concept of new housing, including explicitly below market housing, affordable housing. So you've got the economic incentive for cities to shun new residents. You've got the dynamic of people of intense felt opposition and local elected officials being in the community. And then there's a little bit of a problem with the way that regionalism plays out. You know, the Southern California Association of Governments, as Mike mentioned, has much more responsibility for allocating housing responsibilities among cities in California now. But of course, some of my colleagues on SCAG, that's Southern California Association of Governments, were elected with less than 4,020 votes and have less of a city that's supportive of or interested in solving the problem of the housing shortage. And you've got the dynamic where a city like Los Angeles, which is 40% of Los Angeles County and 10% of the SCAG region by population, often the elected officials there don't attend the meetings, and therefore you end up with enclaves that were founded on exclusion, sort of running the regional show. And that brings up sort of a third point, which is that I think that within the sort of umbrella of the fragmentation of government and the supremacy of exclusive enclaves and land use, we are at a moment, I believe, where there's attention to city government, special attention. I've heard it called a third reconstruction, because if you look at the history of the United States and where we've tamped out the sort of behaviors that result in segregation, the federal government has largely enacted laws. They haven't been implemented in, most notably affirmatively furthering fair housing in the Fair Housing Act, but there have been real changes and real improvements to housing justice. That's true at the state level to some degree too, but if you look at the things where there's social movement right now, it's policing and it's land use. This is the essence. Those two things are the essence of what local government does. So I think that's a big part of the problem that we have to overcome. And the final thing I want to really emphasize is the lack of state capacity as a result of disinvestment in our government institutions over the last 4 decades. A city like Culver City has a small staff, and a paradigm shift which is what I've tried to bring to embrace new housing and to create fundamental reforms that expand supply, provide stability to tenants, and subsidize people who need it. We don't have the staff to move as quickly as we need to. That leads to a reliance on consultants. And while there are a lot of wonderful consultants, and we're going to need them, as I'll talk about in a bit, the typical consultant is just trying to get a job done that checks the boxes, because that's what satisfies people and it avoids controversy. That has been an issue in Culver City, with our housing element process. There was the reference to the regional housing needs allocation and how Southern California Association of Governments kind of allocates each city's responsibility. It's essentially, California essentially has a zoning budget program where every 8 years, the city needs to prepare a housing element that plans for a certain number of homes as dictated by the Southern California Association of Governments in conjunction with the state housing, Department of Housing and Community Development. And this housing element cycle is a total shift. Our expected production over the next 8 years is 10 times what it was in our previous housing previous housing element. And there's a new requirement that that we actually try to plan for these homes, that we don't simply identify a bunch of sites and say homes are going to go here, but that we apply a likelihood of development for every site, so that if our plan for 3,300 homes in Culver City over the next 8 years has to be a credible plan. I kind of perceived this problem, this potential problem with consultants who are not used to cities actually wanting to comply with the law. And so with a UC Davis professor who's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about California housing element law at the moment, I developed some guiding principles that our staff would need to pay attention to by resolution of the city council, and that our consultant would have to abide by. And the first response to those guiding principles from the consultant were sort of resistant. And I think that that's a result of the lack of state capacity. So you've got this minority of very vocal and very passionate people who are opposed to housing. You've got a fragmented system where land use is kind of tucked away at the place that is naturally most conservative, and you have a lack of state capacity to go ahead and change things once you get an awareness and a little bit of social movement towards housing justice. There are other fascinating barriers to new housing, but I won't get into them because there won't be issues until we actually legalize housing. But I will note that there are things in the building code that we could do better. Europe is just running laps around us in terms of the cost of production. Part of that is permitting, part of that is financing difficulties and all that, but ultimately they have a better, more efficient construction industry, and we need to figure out what's wrong here. We need more creative financing mechanism. We need things that people feel a community investment in literally. We need financing for fourplexes and for ADUs. These things don't exist. We need financing for live workspaces. We need financing for the types of homes that made the United States an affordable and great country back before we decided to make it an unaffordable and great country. And we need new ownership models. We need to look at community land trusts. We need to embrace the European concept of the Baugruppen, where people design their own little community together and build it and finance it. But first, we've got to legalize housing. And so how the heck do we do that? And I think it's a great time to ask that question because things are finally happening. There's a grassroots movement in addition to the traditional housing justice movement. And I do believe that those two movements are complementary, even though they don't work together well at the moment. For example, here in Culver City, I mentioned that we added a real estate transaction tax, probably not popular with everyone on this call. We imposed rent control to provide stability, probably not popular with everyone on this call. But you can think about tenants while adding supply. That's in fact, once you do, you realize that there's a lot of opportunity for new neighbors. There's a lot of opportunity for better community. There's a lot of opportunity for those new neighbors to fulfill our environmental goals, to fulfill our fiscal goals, and to provide the sort of diversity that we all say we cherish. And I think many of us really do. It's just very hard to get around some of the difficulties of seeing planning in the United States not deliver those outcomes. But that's a big deal. Having a grassroots movement for more housing is totally new. It didn't exist 10 years ago. We also have an emerging academic and policy consensus that more homes are tremendously beneficial, and that we are approaching value capture in the wrong way, in that we're trying to sort of impose the costs of running a society on activity that serves human needs instead of rent-seeking behavior. That's, that leads to $100,000 per door fees on apartments that are badly needed. But what I want to focus on, and I'll try to be quicker, is state and federal legislation and movement and signaling, because that is, I think, Those other things are necessary and helpful, but it's the state and federal movement that is making things possible right now. At the state level, here in California, you have some great leadership from people like Senator Anthony Weiner and our Senate Pro Tem, Tony Atkins, to tighten up the zoning budget approach to requiring new housing, which I referred to earlier with the housing elements, and to create mandates for local government. That matters. Most notably here in California, we recently passed and the governor signed into law Senate Bill 9, which legalizes up to 4 homes on every R1 zoned lot in the state. That's there's some research that it'll have a modest but significant effect, but psychologically, that is very powerful signal that people like me who are sticking their necks out for housing are on the right track. And the state leadership there is essential for local government. It solves the problem directly, and it does provide the space for people like me to try and solve the problem in Culver City, specifically in our own cities. At the federal level, the Biden administration has been really unprecedented with its signaling on this and its actual commitment to legislation. The Housing Supply and Affordability Act is a big deal. It ultimately is carrots, and I'm going to argue briefly that we need more sticks, which is the sort of mandate at the state level. SB 9 is unquestionably a stick for cities that have guarded their local control and now are not able to block. Effective January 1st, 2022, cities are no longer able to block duplexes and 4-unit setups on single family lots. But the federal level, seeing these carrots and seeing this messaging is very, very helpful. Housing Supply and Affordability Act would create a local housing policy grant program that HUD would administer. It would provide grants to states, cities, tribes, and regional and municipal and county coalitions to support local efforts to expand housing supply. It complements other bipartisan legislation that will encourage local governments to eliminate exclusionary zoning and discriminatory land use policies by providing planning resources. And I mentioned the problems with consultants, but when I also mentioned the limits of state capacity, and we need consultants to make these things happen. So planning grants are very welcome. And when people ask, well, why hasn't this been studied, or what are the effects on X, Y, or Z? Those types of grants allow us to answer the question, even if the person asking the question is not sincerely interested in the answer. So these changes at the state level and the federal level are significant, even if I think that they're not quite sufficient yet. But what I really want to focus on is that we have the opportunity to make all of these things work together. One of the first things I did, this is going to seem a little bit off, but I promise to try and pull it together. One of the first things I did when I was elected was to advocate very vocally and successfully to make sure that elections in Culver City took place on the same day as state and federal general elections. Voter turnout in Culver City's last council election was 85%. That smashed the historically high turnout of 30% in the 2018 election when I was elected. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that my most votes ever record didn't even last one election because we expanded democracy. Who are those new voters? They're more representative. They're not the single issue anti-housing voters. They're everyone. And when you ask a whole city, you're going to find more support for housing. Despite some of the things that people say, the average person understands that new homes bring down prices regionally. You may not be able to move into that new 5/1, but somebody who is not kicking someone else out of a house. And if we don't build those 5/1s, Culver City's growth becomes Inglewood's growth. It becomes displacement in South LA ultimately. Whereas every one of those new research, 100 new market rate homes is the equivalent of opening up 50 or so below market homes. And that's amazing. When you're dealing with a lack of state capacity, you need to take advantage. You need to channel the natural tendency of the market to invest where it'll make money, and you need to serve the community interest with that tendency. So expanding access for your community to the vote will allow pro-housing voices to emerge and take advantage of all of these tendencies. The other thing out there for local officials to take advantage of is the threat of state mandates. If cities had applied a scalpel to enact pro-housing policies 10 years ago, the state of California would not have come along with the sledgehammer of Senate Bill 9 to legalize housing. Communities that really value local control are going to have to be proactive to meet community needs, to meet regional needs. I see some communities doing that. The city of Los Angeles, it's tradition for Culver City to make fun of the city of Los Angeles, but unquestionably the way that they're handling their housing element is one of the most progressive and forward-thinking ways in California. Our own efforts here in Culver City to legalize fourplexes, if we had started that 10 years ago, we would have had a good argument to say we're solving the problem. And finally, federal action provides that moral and political support for people who want to do the right thing. And those planning grants are going to help directly deal with the capacity problem. They're going to help the most in jurisdictions where local elected officials actually want to solve problems. The carrots are not enough, but they help. And while I don't know if California's got 471 other city councils willing to take advantage of those carrots, I'm happy that they're there. I'm happy to use them. So there's your problem. And hopefully I've convinced you that we're in a unique moment of possibility. Yes, we have delegated almost all of the authority over the largest sector of our economy to political entities with borders that were drawn at best by historical accident, and at worst as part of a federally subsidized scheme to segregate Americans from one another. Over the last 4 or 5 decades, those choices have interacted with global forces that are making big U.S. metro areas the places where creativity and opportunity can and are expanding the most dramatically. If you're someone with influence at the federal level, you have every reason to solve the housing shortage. There's a paper by Moretti and Shea from a decade or so ago suggesting that if zoning in just New York, San Jose, and San Francisco were the same permissiveness as the median U.S. city, United States GDP would have been nearly 10% higher in 2009. The most compelling critique of that paper that I've seen suggested that they underestimated the number significantly. So do you want a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, child tax credit, infrastructure, or even if you're just a good old-fashioned deficit hawk, I just found you several $1 trillion. So federal policy people, get us those sticks, get housing justice on the agenda. If you have influence at the state level, keep on advancing intelligent legislation. Go ahead and legalize the housing. Use the sledgehammer if you need to. Use sticks, not just carrots, and craft and implement. When you're crafting your zoning budget programs, that's the most important place for those sticks. Enforce your fair housing laws vigorously and affirmatively further fair housing. Cities are not going to do it alone. And every single one of you has influence at the local level. So support housing in your community, not just projects. Ask for fundamental changes that allow middle housing, that legalize dense housing near transit, and fund below market housing in your community. And heck, run for office. You might only need a few hundred votes to win. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Fisch, again for joining us. I'm Melissa Winkler. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at Up for Growth, and I'll be asking you some questions from the Q&A. So if anyone on the call has questions, just put them into that chat box and we'll try to get them answered. So the first question comes from Disa, who first thanks you for your principled leadership on housing policy, which I think we would all echo. And Disa asks, would you please comment on the importance of local housing production to address the climate crisis and make communities more resilient?
That's such an important question, and I thought about really addressing it in this in the main body of my remarks. But when there's a tool at UC Berkeley's Cool Climate Lab, run by Daniel Kamen, who is a co-lead author on the IPCC climate report, Nobel Prize winner. There's a tool at that institute that shows you if you're a California city, what are the policies that are within your jurisdiction that can most impact your climate reduction goals. And for Culver City and other cities that are job centers, every single one of them has as one of their top 4 infill housing, just legalizing housing, because I think that there's a tendency for people to believe that if we just outlaw the expensive homes, the people who can afford expensive homes will evaporate. But of course they do not. They're exactly the people who can displace other people and in communities that are experiencing a lot of change. They're exactly the people who will pay for the acre-sized ranch in the wildlife urban interface zone. So when we don't legalize infill, and there's clearly massive demand in job-rich cities for homes that are much, much closer to jobs, just by legalizing those, you're preventing that fringe sprawl that is farther from jobs just inherently, resulting in greater vehicle miles traveled, and B, it involves a lifestyle that's inherently more carbon intensive. Multifamily housing is less energy intensive, it's less water intensive, it's likely to be located in a place that's less car reliant. And if you're still relying on a car, you're driving much, much shorter distances to get to jobs. Because in Culver City, we've got, 1 million jobs within an hour, of any home here. The options are incredible. So that's the climate. In terms of resiliency, it's become a tragedy that's right in our faces. We already have climate refugees in California. The city of Paradise burned to the ground, and every single one of the new communities we add out in the grasslands and forests of California is a future paradise, at least at risk. And there are still the impacts on homelessness in the Chico area, and the impacts on rents have been tremendous. If you want to see what happens when it's a natural experiment, and it's not only a climate disaster, it's a natural experiment. When you just remove an entire community worth of homes, those people don't disappear. They end up in the streets of Chico.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Deborah, who asks, what is on your wish list for innovations in housing finance?
That's a great question. I mean, I should think about it more, because it is once we succeed, and we're going to succeed in legalizing housing, we're going to need those options. The most obvious is only obvious because we've legalized accessory dwelling units in California, and there is no robust financing program for that. The people who are most likely to embrace being a small-time landlord are, I think, I would argue, the people who have the least access to finance. If you want to build an accessory dwelling unit in California right now, you can build 2 of them on your lot, at least anywhere. But you need to have home equity, or you need to have other sources of wealth. There is no robust financing program for ADUs, and I think it's easy. I mean, that's a good investment. If I had a bunch of capital, I would be starting that business right now. The other thing is I think financing small plexes, fourplexes, and the small apartment buildings that you see that are the affordable housing in most communities. That's very difficult. And the other is really that live workspace. If you wanted to live above a commercial space, if you wanted to be an artisan with a workspace down below and build a home above it, I'm not aware of any financing products for those people. And I know that is, as we talk about loosening zoning restrictions in exclusionary zoned neighborhoods, and as California has done, eliminate the concept of R1. I think more people are interested in moving some of that development pressure into other parts of the city, and live-work homes are a tremendous opportunity there. So those are the 2 real obvious ones. Getting more exotic, I would love to see the United States begin to look at the Bao grouping concept and begin to talk about how to fund a group of people who want to build their own building together that will serve multiple phases of life.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned NIMBY opposition, which I think is a problem in every city and state across the country. And so I was wondering if you had any kind of concrete solutions that have worked, or arguments that have kind of convinced people who are more hesitant to allow for upzoning or other kind of land use policy changes.
I wish I did. I guess I have a process that I would recommend, and that's that if you're the change maker, the most most stiff housing opposition people are simply never going to. I've yet to see any of them come back. I haven't been surprised by any of the people in Culver City who have been the most opposed to changes. I've been disappointed by a few, but I haven't managed to bring any of those people back with anything, any argument. And I've made them all because I've watched this play out in every community. I've watched it play out in Minneapolis. I watched it play out in Oregon. I watched it play out in Berkeley. I watched it play out in Sacramento. So I've made the arguments. I've had every single one of them, and there's no argument that works. I mean, you should know them, you should make them, because the process that I would recommend is speak to the middle. Speak to your shared values with the people in your community who have not thought about this before, because every single one of those arguments will convince somebody who hasn't thought much about it. The one, for watching some of my progressive friends who were shocked by what I was proposing of legalizing fourplexes, when they saw the connection between slow growth in a place that's adding jobs and displacement in our neighborhoods, in our neighboring communities that are more diverse and have historically suffered from, housing policy generally, that was something that connected with them, and they realized it's not so bad to live next to a fourplex if that means that daycare workers don't have to drive 4 hours or don't get uprooted or don't have to move to Texas. So that's what I recommend, is focus on the shared values of your community with folks who haven't thought about this that much.
Great. And can you repeat the European model that you mentioned, and maybe talk just a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of things in Europe worth emulating, and in other countries. I mean, I would point to Singapore's housing, the way that they treat housing, as a very important model to look at now. But the word I mentioned is Baugruppen. Yep, Ms. Lindgren just shared it. But Baugruppen is a shared housing concept where people cooperate to design and build the home that they're all going to live in. They're intentional communities, and so you'll see people who are all and urban. So you're taking a block of urban space, highly desirable land. People are coming together. They're building more dense housing with shared spaces that allow them that are flexible. And so, for example, if a group of families are moving in and they're all sort of child rearing age, they might have a playground in the center. And as the kids grow up, they might have a skate ramp. And a little after that, they might change it to a garden. But it's sort of an intentional community, a shared project in valuable urban space.
Wonderful. Can you speak to the connection between housing and transit in Culver City and kind of efforts you've made there?
Yeah, I mean, Los Angeles has a fascinating problem of, the suburban model works well if it's not very dense. If the place I grew up, it's until you have to actually get to work, which is the problem with the suburbs, is very easy to motor around and have a sedentary life and take care of your needs. It works in a way. And if you've got a dense community, then your public transit is it can be well funded if you make that choice, but you've got enough ridership to provide really quality transit. You've got enough people going short enough distances that you can really prioritize the pedestrian, the bus, the bicycle. Los Angeles as a region is stuck in between those places where it is fairly dense, but not dense enough yet to make transit really work well. We have to do both at the same time in many of our cities as we retrofit, really. And so in Culver City, our focus right now we haven't yet totally unified it, but we've been focusing on bus lanes, exclusive bus lanes. We've been trying to link and expand our bicycle network with an awareness of how those routes connect to both these bus routes that we're planning and the E line. I always want to say Expo line because that's what it used to be called, but the E line, which is the first east-west connection of our regional rail system, which Culver City is fortunate enough to have a stop at. I think that's essential. You need to connect that high-quality transit throughout your community, in addition to building dense housing around the most high-quality stops. So as you get those bus lanes going, that provides more opportunity for people to live car light or car free, and certainly around a place where the region has invested $2 billion for us to have excellent access to Santa Monica and downtown Los Angeles, jobs in every direction. we, I think, have a responsibility to make sure people can live in those spaces.
Great. And he asked if you're aware of if the banking community is exploring new financing products for ADUs and small developments so that that new SB 90 bill is actually successful. And if not, what can state and local governments do to help spur production there?
That's a great question. I feel like this is a motivated question to get me to start to start talking to the banking community about this, and I think I'm going to take that invitation. But I'm not aware of any efforts to create that. I've been talking about it with ADUs and talking to our local credit unions for some time, but I think it's really time to have those conversations and try to find out what if any blocks, what impediments there are to these programs. Is it simply a question of not wanting to innovate or not seeing a huge profit margin, or are there things that local government, state government, or federal government could do to unlock that financing? And it's the same for SB 9. I think what local governments can do. I expect with SB 9 that the state is going to have several rounds of sort of fine-tuning it, like they did with the accessory dwelling unit legislation. Local government can make it clear how to use SB 9 for homeowners. I think that clarity might help with the finance community develop these products to make it happen. But I am not. Those are just very practical nuts and bolts things that don't actually touch on the financing obstacles. So I'm not sure what state or local governments can do other than to provide certainty to people who want to do those projects and to the people who might be interested in financing those projects.
Yeah, good. Sounds like a good next step. Well, thank you again for joining us. I think Mike Kinsella is going to come back and do a closing, but thank you for your time today. It was a great insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Mayor Fisch, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to share your perspectives and experiences from Culver City. I think this has been a really robust and great conversation, and really a great way to kick off our coming several weeks of programming at Up for Growth 2021. I do want to flag relative to the last individual's question, David's question on SB 9 and missing middle policies and financing opportunities. We are going to have a speaker on Thursday, Sam Diaz, the Senior Housing Policy Advisor to Portland, Oregon Mayor Ted Wheeler, who was instrumental in moving that city's missing middle duplex triplex bill a year or two ago. So a good check-in opportunity. So I would encourage you, David, and others with interest to tune in for that conversation around local housing policy and zoning reform innovation to delve deeper into production of the missing middle. Really great conversation. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for tuning in. We look forward to really exciting discussions throughout the rest of the week and into the following two. If you all have any questions about Up for Growth, don't hesitate to reach out to us through the web link that Lauren shared a bit ago in the chat. And if you have any questions around registering for additional sessions, don't hesitate to reach out either. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate the participation, and we look forward to seeing you soon.